and thinking about the UDL framework, we look at what the curriculum requires, and then we look at the assessment task, and quite often there's a big mismatch. So it's important to ensure that your assessment tasks are universally designed in the sense that they're only essentially assessing what the curriculum is asking and giving kids opportunities to demonstrate above the achievement standard and not adding superfluous things, and they're accessible to all. So let's have a look at what the research says, and then let's have a look at how we can apply this to the Australian curriculum. And then I've got a whole lot of examples to show you from the work we've done with teachers. So this is coming back to the definition of universal design from the NCCD. So Thompson and Thurlow identified 7 characteristics of universally designed assessment. Let's have a look at those. They're pretty generic in the sense of what research says. And then let's look at what it actually practically means for the Australian curriculum. So these are the 7 elements that Jonathan and Thurlow talk about in terms of universally designed assessment. So they're pretty general ideas. Let's look at what it means for the Australian curriculum and how we can do it within an Australian context. So these are the 8 steps that we would follow to ensure that an assessment task is universally designed in relation to the Australian curriculum. This is a simple checklist you could use with your teachers to go through an assessment task and tick off when it meets each one of those criteria. So let's have a look going step by step through each one of those steps. Okay, so step 1 is working out what is the achievement standard being assessed by the assessment task. Is it assessing those achievement standards, or is it assessing the content descriptors? Coming back to, are we assessing what the achievement standards actually ask in the Australian curriculum, because that's what students need to demonstrate evidence of learning against, or are we assessing something else? The next process is, once we've identified and ensured that the assessment task is assessing that achievement standards that we're assessing, looking at what the achievement standards are around that. So if we're looking at year 7, we have a look at what 5 and 6 and 8 are asking students to demonstrate. And that would be dependent on our student population, because if we want to collect evidence of learning for a student, if we're solely hitting the year 7 achievement standard, a student might be demonstrating above or below, but we don't know that because we're focused solely on developing assessment instruments that look at that 1 year level. If we come back to this example I've shown you previously, this is all the punctuation that the Australian curriculum in English requires students to demonstrate from 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So if we develop an assessment task that students demonstrate their punctuation, what they show us in that assessment task, we could map against those achievement standards to work out where a student is sitting. Interestingly enough, when we look at punctuation, each year level differs by one thing. I like to use color coding to show the difference. So the only difference between year 3 and year 4 is using quotation marks for titles and direct speech. So if a student demonstrates this and that, they've demonstrated year 4. But if we develop assessment tasks that only hit 1 year level, so say year 7, students can't demonstrate above or struggling to demonstrate below. If we have a look at mathematics, I've mapped here year 5, 6, 7, 8 in relation to locations and transformations. So in year 5, students use a grid referencing system to locate landmarks. Year 6, students locate an ordered pair in a Cartesian plane. Year 7, they determine the ordered pairs on a Cartesian plane. And year 8, they solve linear equations. So if we know the achievement standards and what they require students to demonstrate along the spectrum, both of the year we're teaching and a bit around it, we can create assessment tasks that allow students to demonstrate what they know. So let's go to the next one. defining all relevant cognitive verbs. If you remember back to that first assessment, first webinar where we did that Kahoot activity and we tested your knowledge individually of the definitions of the cognitive verbs, it's really important to ensure that that's what's being asked in the assessment task. So today I was sitting on Kahoot and I went through all 800 people, 808 actually, people that have done Kahoot quizzes with me over the last 12 months. And I actually worked out the percentage of each cognitive verb people got correct. So I thought I'd just show this to you. So here's the cognitive verbs that we assessed. And this is the percentage of people out of the 808 that got it right. So out of the 808 teachers, primary and secondary surveyed, 81% of the people were able to define, evaluate correctly. So about 8 out of 10 people were able to define, evaluate. Down at the bottom here, explain, which is a common cognitive verb, only 1 out of 3 primary and secondary teachers were able to define what explain means. So if only 1 out of 3 teachers can define what explain means, what are we teaching and what are we assessing? So I might be teaching one thing for explain, but it actually means very different and I'm assessing something different. So that could be a potential barrier to the learning process. Coming back to what is the cognitive verbs actually asking of the Australian curriculum and ensuring that's what I teach, but that's also what I assess. So explain means to provide additional information to show understanding. So it's not a student regurgitating information that a teacher taught. So if a teacher explained 3 ideas related to World War I and the student wrote those 3 ideas down, that's not explain. That's regurgitating what the teacher taught. Explain is to provide additional information to show understanding. They're looking for something more. So if we're assessing something that's not explained, because we don't know how to define the cognitive verbs, that could be a barrier to the learning process. So once we define the cognitive verbs, it's also important to define that relevant terminology. If we look at the science example we used in webinar 1, where we looked at observable in science, doesn't mean just what we see, but it means what we taste, touch, feel, hear. We need to define those because that's really important in what our assessment task looks like. And we can use that content descriptors to flesh out any terminology in the elaborations if needed. So if we have a look, for example, this comes from a Cairns High School that I work with, year 10, looking at history, looking at Kokoda and Australia's involvement in Kokoda during World War II. These were the achievement standards that the students needed to demonstrate. So working with the teachers and defining all the cognitive verbs, as well as the important terminology, and then thinking about the UDL framework. And we took that achievement standard and created 2 questions and frameworks for students to demonstrate what they know to demonstrate that achievement standard. So why did Australia fight at Kokoda during World War II? So the students are given a whole lot of visual and written stimulus. And so they use a color code scaffold. So topic, sentence, analyzing argument, students put in there what they're going to demonstrate, which comes back to demonstrating up here. Explanation using historical terms and concepts, which hits the achievement standard. Evidence synthesized from primary and secondary evidence up here. Analysis of the origin, purpose, and context of the evidence up here. Discussion of usefulness of sources up here. So this school has taken the achievement standard, we deconstructed what the content, cognitive verbs, and important terminology are asking, then thinking about how we can support our learners to demonstrate this. Notice this scaffold or framework doesn't tell students any answers. There's no closed paragraphs, closed sentences, or anything like that. What students put in here demonstrates their learning. So it might demonstrate year 10, but what they put in there might also demonstrate a lower achievement standard. So if we come back to the punctuation from English, what the students put into this and then take from this and put into a paragraph would demonstrate their ability around punctuation. Similar second question, why did the Japanese withdraw from Kokoda during World War II? Once again, the scaffold and structure comes back to what the achievement standard is asking students to demonstrate, rather than something else. And we determine that by making sure we have assessed the achievement standards, defining the cognitive verbs, defining any important terminology. And if we think back to the UDL framework that we looked in the third webinar, the color coding process and scaffolding provides students with a way of internalizing that process of comprehension so that they can become lifelong learners. The next step in determining and designing universally designed assessment is reviewing that assessment task to look, is there anything irrelevant in there? Is there any relevant skills or knowledge not outlined in the achievement standards being assessed? So if we have a look back to this, this actually comes from the school that I work at. This is from Year 7 English, where the students had to write a story with a number of 3 problems and a main character. So you've got color coding, looking at what the student needs to demonstrate, and a tick list, coming back to what the achievement standard requires students to demonstrate, and having a checklist of what students need to include in their paragraph. So we're thinking about how we develop assessment tasks that take out those irrelevant elements, but provide those cognitive frameworks for demonstrating what they need to demonstrate against the achievement standard. The way that this is structured is it doesn't hold the students to just demonstrating Year 7. They can go above because the teachers know what the 8, 9, and 10 achievement standards require, and they can demonstrate below. But what they show as evidence of learning tells us where they sit, rather than developing assessment tasks that really structured to only Year 7. So if you don't demonstrate this, you fail. If you demonstrate above, that becomes a bit of an issue. If we have a look coming back to, these are from Year 7 and secondary school here in Brisbane, looking at what the Year 7 achievement standards. So explains, provide additional information that shows reasoning, role of groups and significance of particular individuals in society, compare and use information. So we've used a table here, and the schools decided rather than, they don't have to write a text because they're only assessing that achievement standard, looking at how the students can do it. So the group pharaohs, what were their significance in society? What evidence did they use to make that decision? Why is this evidence useful, and where did I get it from? Here in geography, Year 7, students describe a count of characteristic of features, geographical processes that influence characteristics of places and perceived and valued differently. Rivers, erosion, salinity, and what the characteristics of them are, and how are rivers perceived by First Nations people and non-First Nations people. So the developing universally designed assessment is thinking about coming back to what is the achievement standard essentially asking by defining those cognitive verbs, important terminology, and making sure you're only assessing that. If you look at the Queensland Department of Education's CARF, it defines 2 types of assessment. It talks about formative assessment and summative assessment. They define formative assessment as standardized assessment like NAPLAN and information collected to make a teaching decision. They define summative assessment as information collected to make a decision against grades. And this here could be used as evidence against grades if it's mapped against a grading rubric or something like that. Coming back to that Year 10 example from Cairns, where history teachers, and often in Year 10, teachers are starting to think about 11 and 12. So they had students doing a research project, and often in secondary school, being a secondary teacher in history, students often do a research booklet. And what they looked at is when they looked at the research booklet they had kids doing, it took a long time and it actually wasn't mapped to the achievement standard at all. So what we did is we went back to the achievement standards, broke them down, defined key terminology and what they were looking for. And we rewrote the research booklet so that each part of the research booklet hits the achievement standard. So if in this school, they have a large absentee rate. So if a student's away and they do the research booklet, they can demonstrate its standard against the Australian curriculum, achievement standards. They don't get to writing text, that's okay. Notice we use the color coding because often when we're thinking about developing persuasive text and things like that, because we have to take information from a whole lot of different places and put it into a persuasive paragraph or a persuasive essay, we use this color coding to support that. So have a look at the color coding and how it's used in the research booklet. And those colors show students where that information goes as they move into writing their persuasive essay. You don't have to use color coding, but it's just a good way to connect ideas from one place to another. So then we need to think about, in universally designed assessment, are we providing those opportunities for students to demonstrate a lower level or a higher level? So because traditionally, let's say a year 7 mathematics test might have questions that hit year 7, and if I get them wrong, I'm a D or an E, but it actually doesn't tell me where a student is sitting. Vice versa, where are they above? So we need to provide those opportunities to do that. So if we come back to that example from mathematics before, where in year 5, students had to locate an object using a grid, then use identify a location using points in a Cartesian plane, determine the points on a Cartesian plane, then use linear equations. One task could be used to map a student if they're sitting at 5, 6, or 7 on the achievement standards mathematics. Remember, universally designed assessment is taking out those superfluous things. So we're looking at the mathematics here. We're not looking at the literacy. So if we look at this one here, so we've got a grid reference system with foods located at different locations. So students use a grid reference system to locate a landmark, circle the food below located at D4. We're taking out the literacy. The students are just circling which one is located at D4. And if a student does this, it demonstrates they're at year 5 achievement standard around that locations and transformation. Students locate an ordered pair using a 4 quadrants of the Cartesian plane, circle the letter below located at -4, -6. Taking out the literacy, they just circle it. Students assign ordered pairs to given points. So, sorry, what happened? So if we have a look at this one, for example, they've given 3 letters and they identify the points on the Cartesian plane. So this one piece of paper allows the teacher to work out where a student is sitting against the achievement standards in year 5, 6, and 7. And you could go above or further below. But that universally designed assessment provides you that information to allow students to have success. Wouldn't it be good to be able to go to a parent, you know, your child's demonstrating at a year 5 achievement standard in this locations and transformations, rather than saying, sorry, your child's in year 7 and they're getting a D or an E. So universally designed assessment requires you to have a broader understanding of the curriculum. So we look at reviewing all tasks to ensure that they're easily understood. How could that comprehension or understanding of that task be easily done? And what I would do is get a colleague to have a look at an assessment task, get them to read through it. Does it make sense? If I'm a mathematics teacher or a history teacher, don't get a mathematics or history teacher to look at an assessment task, because they bring their knowledge of curriculum and content to that. Get someone in a different department or a non-teacher to look at it. So make sure it makes sense, so they get explained to what to do, because often tasks are hard to understand. And if they're hard to understand for someone who's not in that area, they're going to be hard to understand for your students. And ensure that when you look at your grading rubric, that the C standard is what the achievement standard is asking. So go back, look at your assessment task, look at the achievement standard, ensure that it's in there. And when you're looking at your grading rubric, make sure that the C is what the achievement standard is asking. A lot of the schools that I work with, I travel all over the country, and in Queensland, schools that use C2C, remember C2C as a resource was developed many years ago. And we're now at version 8.4 of the curriculum. Whilst you might use the guide to making judgment, it's really important to check that it's still aligned to the C standard for the achievement standard. We've discovered that sometimes what is in a D is actually what the achievement standard is asking in version 8.4. Swings and roundabouts, sometimes what's in a B is actually what the achievement standard is asking. So it's really important to review that. Every time I do this with people, they say, but what about reporting? And reporting is